one of the punchlines here is, you guys are looking at colon cancer tissue and you're seeing lipid dysregulation and you're seeing basically more pro-inflammatory lipids. Let's just put it in very simple terms. How obviously one plausible hypothesis here as to what the origin of that is that people are eating dietary omega-6 fatty acids because of all the seed oils and everything. Is that Are there any other plausible explanations for this? Are there alternative explanations for this? Or do we think it's very likely to be seed oil consumption?
Well, I think it could be also, omega-6s from your diet from other sources. Again, if you're eating grass-fed animals, grass-fed beef,
Yeah.
pork, etc., that's high, 25 to 1.
You mean grain fed?
Grain-fed, excuse me. Thank you. That's high in these ratios. Is omega-6 different from seed oil? Yes. Seed oil is a different process. We haven't talked about how it's processed, and some are highly processed, some are cold pressed,
Yep.
some are high oleic, low oleic. I mean, we don't really understand what all that means yet, but there are different processes for this, and probably the more processing, the worse it is. But again, we don't know for sure, but we'd suspect that.
Mm-hmm.
So you could get omega-6 from various components of your diet, but if you factor in, I don't eat a lot of salmon, or I do, or I
Yep.
don't eat a lot of nuts, or I
Right.
do.
Are you
With
balancing it with the omega-3s?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I've heard that it's just hard to get enough omega-3s in your diet
Yeah.
because of the bias of the omega-6s
Yeah.
and all
I
the
mean,
other foods we
yes.
eat.
Yeah. And if I'm understanding, so the problem isn't that people can't get enough omega-3s, period. It's really that there's so much omega-6 in the environment that you kind of have to eat an incredible amount
Right.
of
Now you
omega-3s.
might say, well, let's start taking fish oil as a
Yeah.
supplement. Well, number one, it can cause atrial fibrillation, particularly in men, if you take over, I think, 2 to 3 grams a day. So that's a
Mm.
risk. You don't want to get atrial fibrillation.
Yeah. Yeah.
It can cause problems with clotting and this sort of, and it
Yeah.
hasn't been demonstrated to give great effects on heart disease and so forth. So you probably can't take enough of them to balance it. There is something called SPM, specialized pro-resolving mediators. Those are online. We're looking at those as a potential anti-inflammatory supplement. That's what they're promoted as. I think they probably do have those effects. They're probably more potent than fish oil.
Hmm.
Don't seem to have the AFib risk yet, but they probably have been studied in large enough populations. But again, there are things we can do probably with our diet first, but it's difficult. You might have to grow back to making your own garden in your backyard with a lot of greens and eating more nuts, walnuts, almonds, things like that, Brazil nuts, and avoiding the breads that are and salad dressing and all these other things that are, loaded with the soybean oil.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify some terminology here for people, so there's some overlap between some of these concepts. So when we say things like seed oils versus omega-6s, et cetera, so one of the keys here, I think, is that the omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid that's the most common in these foods in general, my understanding, is linoleic acid. And that is the precursor to arachidonic acid and a lot of the stuff you guys have been talking about.
Yeah, and what we haven't talked about is a linoleic acid can be oxidized. It can go to a lot of other things too.
Yeah.
And we don't know what all those things do and are. But arachidonic acid is certainly one pathway that can go down.
Yeah.
It's complex. The biology is very complex.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's almost goes without saying, but I think one of the reasons it's so interesting, but also why there's so many different viewpoints when people start getting into this stuff is that the biology is very complex here.
Right. And there's a lot of people trying to defend the seed oils because they're in everything. And it's going to be hard to change that. I think the market will change it, to be honest with you, just like the market's moved more companies away from sugar to artificial sugars, and stevia is now becoming more popular because it's natural and may not affect the microbiome, for example. So I think the same thing could happen with the seed oils as has happened with the sugars, moving to more natural things. It may cost a little more, but in the long run, it's going to be healthier.
Yeah, you pay a little bit more now for food, but you might pay a lot less later from your hospital
Exactly.
bills.
Right. Or the government paying for it and your
Yeah,
taxes and everything
yeah,
else
yeah.
piles up.
So there's a little bit more to discuss in the paper, but we've gotten to the essence of it. Um, people, this was getting a lot of attention, which is great because I'm really interested in this field. It wasn't the field I was trained in and stuff, but I've gotten really interested in this, lipid biology and lipid dysregulation, how that ties into diet. I think it's a fascinating field, and it's really consequential stuff here. We're talking about cancer, certain cancers are on the rise, diet, whether or not whatever your viewpoints are on diet and what is or is not healthy and all the holy wars people get into, it's obviously an important subject, and all of these things tie together in a really interesting and complex way with some of this story here. And one of the things I sort of saw people yelling different things about this, and I want to just get it directly from the guys who did the study. What's sense and what's nonsense here? There's lots of headlines out there where people are basically saying study proves seed oils give you cancer, period. And then there's a lot of other people, some of them scientists, that were saying things like this study had nothing to do with seed oils or diet. So where's the signal and where's the noise in those types of statements?
Yeah, it's somewhere in the middle probably. Yeah, we did not prove cause and effect of seed oils to cancer or seed oils to anything because we didn't study seed oils. We were looking at the tumor tissue in large enough sample size. No one else has done that kind of sample size in human colon tissues,
Mm-hmm.
and we saw what I feel is the smoking gun. So I think we have a smoking gun story where we see this inflammation that's significant in the tissues, and you've got to ask, where did it come from? It's got to come from the diet, and then you get backwards. Well, where in the diet could it possibly come from? And
Yeah.
what's happened in the last 50 years
Yeah.
in our diet?
When you say it's got to come from the diet, why is that your
Well,
viewpoint?
because arachidonic acid and omega-6s these are essential fatty acids,
Body can't
and
make them on its own.
correct, you have to get them from the diet. So that's sort of prima facie evidence again that
Yeah.
the
So
diet's
so
involved.
so
But
you didn't prove, as
right,
when we say prove, we're being, as a scientist, we didn't prove directly that it was the seed oils, but you're basically saying it's very difficult to imagine where else this would come from.
right, because that's been the big change.
Yeah.
And if again, we had the same problem with cigarettes and cancer. If you
Right.
remember, for
Right.
years, cigarettes don't cause cancer. And it would use the example that, well, not everybody gets cancer that smokes. That's true. But they get heart disease and COPD and other things and
Yeah.
strokes and
Yeah.
diabetes and Alzheimer's, but they're not,
Right.
it's not connected causally. But we all know it actually probably is. It just took a long time to really find the exact proof and the methylation events or the
Yeah.
mutational events
Yeah.
that,
And we're talking
so
about
in,
stochastic biological processes here. Like,
right,
yeah.
exactly. So this is, hard to prove that cause and effect. But I could tell you this: the dietary studies, the epidemiology studies, that's a different science than lab-based studies.
Yeah.
If you look at epidemiology and diet histories and all that, they have some inaccuracies to them, right?
Oh, yeah.
And that's why people go to meta-analyses to try to prove their case, because one study is not, the be all and end all of like a gene knockout study.
Yep.
Ours is also flawed because you have it's translational research. You're looking at heterogeneity of 81 patients, but there's this definite trend here that's statistically significant that we see in the lipidomics technology. And we also did spatial transcriptomics, which was looking at the gene expression of individual cells within the tissue, and we related ALOX5 and 5AP overexpression to the very tumors that had the highest LTB4 levels. So we're seeing, the enzymes responsible for breaking down the inflammatory lipids to lipid mediators are inflammatory in the actual tissues. We see the lipid levels in the tissues, and yes, we got to relate it back to something in our diet. Now, what's changed our diet? It started with margarine. It started with adding seed oils to foods instead of saturated fats. And people say, well, heart attacks have changed when we went from saturated fats to margarine. We reduced heart attack risk. Well, that may be true because you reduce saturated fats, but now if you replace them with an unbiased additive of polyunsaturated omega-6s, I think that becomes inflammatory. So studies can be manipulated lots of different ways. That's why I like the hard science of lipidomics and tissue spatial transcriptomics and things we did, as opposed to just purely dietary histories. And I mean, how really carefully can you take dietary history on someone?
Right.
And when you go to a restaurant, right, it's Russian roulette
Yeah, you don't
for
know.
what. Well, put a Dexcom on your or one of these glucometers on your arm, and
Yeah.
go to a restaurant and find out how many times it spikes. There's sugar in everything. There's bad fats and everything. Although restaurants may tend to use more olive oil than processed food companies, because they're cooking, right there in front of you.
Um, yeah, and another thing sort of in this world of there's a lot of complexity here. There's the biological complexity of the phenomena we're talking about, but there's also right basic research, clinical research, epidemiology, all different types of studies that different types of scientists conduct. They all have their different strengths and weaknesses. One of the things that I want to ask you guys about, I actually asked it a little bit before, but I want to come back to it, is, you have people debating, experts debating about seed oils. Some people say, well, the seed oils are clearly pro-inflammatory because we know all of this biochemistry that's been worked out, all the stuff that you guys were talking to us about. And the story fits very beautifully in many ways, in my opinion, and in certain people's opinions. But then other people will say, they're usually more clinically oriented people. They'll say, great, that's all great. The basic biology sounds good in theory, but we don't see our randomized control trials clearly showing that seed oil consumption causes an increase in all of our favorite inflammatory markers. How do you guys think about those elements of the literature here?
I'll address it, and then Ganesh can address it. But some of these trials I've read, we did 10 weeks of increasing obesity diet for a patient and 10 weeks for a normal diet. Well, and then we looked at plasma levels of omega-6 and omega-3. And okay, is 10 weeks a lifetime? No. I mean, I don't think this is glacial stuff. It doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
It takes decades, right? So decades of exposure may cause these risks. So I think some of these studies that are randomized control, you can't do it long enough to see the effects. That's number one. Number two, I think we didn't talk about some other things that are happening, and we have no explanation for it. Why do we see an increase in colon cancer under the age of 40? There's a substantial increase in the last 10 to 20 years.
Yeah, and
what's that all
why
about?
in younger people? That is strange.
Right. So what has changed?
Yeah.
The only thing that has changed is really, quite frankly, diets, and maybe levels of exercise and so forth. But the children today have been exposed to more of these PUFAs, these polyunsaturated fatty acid omega-6 varieties than I was, as a child growing up. And so there's a big difference, and we haven't explained it yet clinically. No one has, and we need to figure it out. But we need to, I think it's the default is we should assume that it's the diet and prove it's not.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, oh, the diet's probably safe, let's look for some other cause.
Yep. And I think that's super important.
Yeah.
I think both things you just said are super important. So we shouldn't assume by default that these things are good unless proven otherwise, because they're so brand new. Or we don't have a long history with these things, except after we started making them at an industrial scale. But Tim, something you said there I think is very important, which is, like, I'm speaking from my perspective here, so I'm not going to speak for anyone else. So just for everyone listening. No one is saying randomized control trials aren't great and we shouldn't look for things in them. But a key limitation with this area of biology is, as you said, Tim, a lot of the stuff moves at a slow pace in terms of, our diets shift lipid profiles and things in ways that won't manifest in clinically relevant markers that we can measure unless you're talking about months or even years of time. And just to put a little bit more meat on the bone there are studies in animals, and sometimes people say, yeah, it's an animal study, it's not a human study, we should ignore it. But there are animal studies that very clearly show that when you change the dietary fatty acid composition in rodents, you can see substantial changes, but they take sometimes 16 weeks to manifest in a mouse. And that would be like 10 plus years in a human being. And as you said, Tim, a lot of these clinical trials, even when they're well conducted, and even though it's, a 10-week long clinical trial is a big, expensive effort, and that's very commendable. But unfortunately, a lot of this biology would require us to do very, very, very long studies that really just can't be done.
A number of the older studies, the Framingham study, the Nurses' Health study, those followed nurses and people over years,
Yeah.
decades. And granted, diet histories or diet recall histories are not that great because what did you eat for breakfast 3 days ago? Well, if you didn't fill out your diet right away, you may not remember, right?
Yeah.
So how accurate is that is another question. But those studies are what it takes that's why those studies identified LDL and risk of heart attack with high LDL levels. They looked over years at people, not just a randomized control trial. So I think there are artifacts and there are weaknesses to any study.
Yeah.
A lot more works. And the other part of this whole thing, again, is this microbiome picture. So
Hmm.
again, I challenge you to take a loaf of bread off the shelf and look at everything that could be in it.
Yeah.
And soybean oil is one of the things, but there's often other things in it like preservatives and natural flavors and dyes and this and that. What do they do to the microbiome? I don't know. I mean, it's WNL. We never looked, and because we haven't looked yet. We didn't
Hmm.
have the technology, but now we do. And we now know that the microbiome controls the immunity, and there's the gut-brain axis. There's some evidence of the gut-heart axis. So if the gut microbiome is so critical, and the food, and obviously it makes sense, right? So the food is nourishing our entire body. Got to go
Right.
through that gut passage first. It's kind of like common sense. So I would say the common sense approach is to use the default that these things are likely problematic, prove that they're not, and be much more, or take them out of the diet and just substitute. I think the American public is going to, eventually have an outcry and force the food industry to change,
Hmm.
and they will. They respond to the market. If people stop buying goods, the market responds. That's one of the beauties of capitalism. They will change. So.
I just
Ganesh,
want to
anything
point
to add to that in terms of how, like, as a hardcore lipidomics guy, how you sort of integrate and interpret the clinical versus the basic research literature on this stuff?
Sure, yeah, and this applies to kind of multiple formulations or products in the market. What is assumption? And I know when I talk to my 15-year-old son, a high schooler, and he said, hey, and he said, read the package. Oh, this is real. This is green. This is healthy, and that's where perception. But he don't read like, okay, how much the content of these seed oils is there and what is the impact on the body. And that's what the Americans did. They are doing like, oh, this is written as a healthy, real, natural, and kind of it's hijacking your senses and you are following that 100% and using those products. But when you see this kind of real versus unreal study or how much we have to believe, and that happened to the omega-3 fatty acids. And that's true. Some people say, hey, omega-3 is really helping for me, for my kind of cardiac stuff. And some 50% saying, oh, no, it's a garbage, don't use it. And then the question is, hey, is your body's enzyme to process omega-3 is working? Oh, I don't know. And that's the kind of reaction of the kind of in the population study. But here we are talking about totally different approach. Hey, what are the levels of these particular very bioactive lipids at the site of where there is a problem, like a tumor? And that's where the chemistry clearly telling us that, hey, these are from. Now the question, hey, tell me how you can prove it. Because one thing we have to believe very kind of old-fashioned study, and that's where this coin essential facts. Those were husband and wife, the George Bird and the Mildred Bird. What they did, they kind of removed totally fat from the rat diet. What they noticed, those rats were dying way earlier. They have skin problems and many problems. And as soon as they add 2-3 drops of the fat, and then they start surviving and much more better health. It means the fat is essential.
Hmm.
One confounding factors we have to understand, even the glucose also disrupt the lipid metabolism. Fructose also disrupt the lipid metabolism. So many dietary kind of choices, the impact on lipid metabolism, but this was never studied. So that is the one reason, yes, there is possible everyone can see, oh, there is a lot of smoke in the study because we are not considering what the populations were eating. That's 100% right. But we know that these molecules are exclusively come from only fat that every day we eat. And that's a very obvious connection for us, how it is kind of changing the precision of our immune system, which is key for our health.